only starting to repay your loans at 21,000 and any earnings above that, not at, I think it was 15,000 beforehand. And crucially, it was tapered so that it was like a sort of, well, it is actually a sort of progressive graduate tax. The more you earned above that, the more you paid back. The less you earned, the less you paid back. Such that, even today, but I'll come in a minute to the recent changes, you actually pay back, you pay back longer, of course, but you pay back as a graduate less out of your bank account every week and every month under the new system than you did under the old system introduced by Labour. And it was also flanked with some very important additional grants, not loans, grants to cover living expenses for kids from lower income groups. Now, what's happened since then? That was the deal. Controversial, highly controversial though that it was. That was the kind of arrangement, and everyone more or less, most people disagree with it, but most people understood it. The new Conservative government has done a number of things which I think are deeply regrettable. Firstly, they have frozen the 21,000 repayment thing, which is I know I'm not the best witness on all of this, but we had this very, very painful debate. I spilt, legitimately no doubt from your point of view, a lot of political blood for it, but we had a legitimate debate which said, okay, we've inherited a system where the general taxpayer and the graduate kind of divides up the cake for the cost of higher education. That's something we inherited. It wasn't invented by me or the coalition, it was inherited. It was adjusted in the light of what Lord Brown said, but crucially, the commitment was to graduates that 21,000 would go up, would be indexed. Freezing that, I think, was a dramatic rewriting of the kind of contractual terms, if you like, that a lot of youngsters had entered into. And then on top of that, probably one of the most regressive things of all, because you'll know this better than I do, in terms of social justice, if I can put it like that, what you pay back over your working life, or indeed what you don't pay back at all, in 20, 30 years' time, long after you've graduated, is much less important than the upfront living costs. And that is, in many ways, it's shown, study after study, that's the great big impediment. To turn the grants that were provided to cover those upfront living costs into loans, I think was a deeply regressive thing to do. And I think on top of that, and I say this, of course, somewhat hesitantly, knowing that the Vice-Chancellor is sitting there, will have something to do with the way in which the new mechanism operates. But I think on top of those recent regressive measures, the freezing of the 21,000, the conversion of the grants into loans for upfront living costs, on top of that to introduce these variable fees breaking way through the 9,000 barrier, through a system of regulation and inspection and stuff, which I just find very difficult to understand. I just worry about forget the issues of principle, I just find the sheer complexity and the kind of, I think it's going to become bureaucratically very, very fraught between regulator and universities. I worry that that's becoming both more complex and more difficult to justify. And then, of course, on top of that, we've had this massive whammy for the higher education sector of Brexit, which has already led, as we've heard from statistics today, to this very, very sharp decline in students from elsewhere in the European Union. So for all of those reasons, I don't support, and my party does not support, the recent changes mooted by Jo Johnson, the Conservative Secretary of State, driving this through, nor do we support the legislation currently, I think, in the House of Lords.
Spencer, would you like to respond as a Conservative spokesman?
Yes, a little bit of history. In 2005, as I've said, I got to contest the election against Nick. And just to say on Natalie's point, because I think this informs our democracy debate, it's very frustrating to be a Conservative in the city of Sheffield because fair votes would be very positive for me. I'm actually a Conservative that supports make your vote count and all of your vote matters and proportional representation. And that sits rather unusually in my party, but I sit in a desert island called Sheffield where there's not a single Conservative councillor. The chances of a Member of Parliament, I accept, are not high, but this causes great concern when we talk about this democratic deficit, because many people in the city of Sheffield vote Conservative, but they don't have their voice perhaps heard as loudly as I personally would would like. With regards to the tuition fees, in 2010, I was the candidate in Penistone and Stocksbridge. It was what the Conservative Party called the one target seat. We were working very hard to try and get me elected and to have one blue voice in South Yorkshire. And I stood on a ticket that said tuition fees, as Nick has said, were already there, and that to maintain the funding necessary in the partnership between the state and the student, those fees were going to have to go up. And I'm not saying that I lost on the back of being a Conservative in West Barnsley and tuition fees, but I know from the doorstep that that didn't go down at all well, and I have to accept that. As do, I hope we would agree, the tricky accommodations that the government is having to make with regards to funding of our very valuable universities in an environment where Brexit will, I am sure, have some type of impact, and that comes back to a democratic decision. We have to deal with that decision. The other thing that I would say with regards to the new framework and this view that university is elitist, I hope we can get very much to a situation where if you need and want to go to university because you are studying for a degree course that needs a university education, that you will come to university and you won't be put off by that fee. And I also hope very much that rather than the Labour Party's position in the Parliament before last, which was that everybody should go to university, that there are plenty of excellent jobs out there for people who are apprentices, who would take their education further through different mechanisms. And I hope we can rebalance in that way. University isn't right for everybody. Many people will have great careers, wonderful incomes, happy family lives on the back of never going to university. So I think that's an important point to add to.
Or would you like to respond and perhaps take up those team's points?
Yeah, well, let me just correct Spencer. First of all, it was never a Labour government's objective that everybody should go to university. It was our objective that everybody should have good opportunities post-school. And the Labour government's target was to get to about 50%, and that felt about right. But also to look at creating more apprenticeship opportunities. And at the last election, it was recognising that we needed to take a more nuanced view of post-18, so that we didn't see them as separate routes, university for some and apprenticeships for others, but interweaving routes and as part of a process of lifelong learning. I mean, I know a young, not so young now, but a lad who went to work went to take an apprenticeship at the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre in Sheffield. He hadn't done very well at school, took to an apprenticeship learning fantastically well, but that led him back into conventional learning. He went on to do a master's and is now doing postgraduate research work. So I think we've got to see the opportunities in a much more different way. I don't want to add to Nick's misery because he's clearly been through hell over tuition fees. But the point that I would make is that I'm proud to represent more students by far than any other Member of Parliament in the country, 36,000. And in 2010, my election battle was with the Liberal Democrats. And the problem with the position that Nick subsequently took on tuition fees was not that he gave consideration once in government to the Brown Review, but that in constituencies like mine, the Liberal Democrats ran their election on the promise not to increase tuition fees and within the lifetime of the next Parliament to abolish them altogether. Now, I know that Nick thought that even at the time that was an unwise promise, but that was their position. And I think that the volte-face that they subsequently did a huge negative impact on politics and the way that young people viewed politics, even those who weren't planning to go to university. On the specific questions, I think that it's absolutely wrong for the current government to link the latest fee increase to the Teaching Excellence Framework. And I don't know how many people are familiar with the TEF here. I mean, there are arguments about universities requiring funding, and there are and that's something that government has to grapple with. And we do want our universities to be properly funded. But the tool that they've chosen to use, the Teaching Excellence Framework, is a huge mistake. I think it's absolutely fair to look towards having objective measures of teaching quality within our universities. We had a system for measuring research quality, and I think it helps encourage a process which has been going on for some time in higher education to pay more attention to teaching and the experience that undergraduates have. But if you are going to introduce a Teaching Excellence Framework, you need to do it on good measures. And the three key measures that this government has chosen to use are firstly graduate earnings, secondly retention rates, and thirdly national student satisfaction scores. Now graduate earnings, I put it to Joe Johnson, who I think Joe went to Eton, didn't he?
Sure, I know.
Sorry, you were at Westminster. The current university's minister, Eton, Oxford, and onwards. And I put it to him that, Joe, if you come from the right family, you go to the right school, and you go on to Oxbridge, you are going to get a good job, even if the quality of your teaching is awful. And it's no measure of teaching quality. If you come out of university and you go into certain disciplines in Sheffield, you'll get paid less than if you go to the same job in London or other parts of the country, because there's a regional inequity in earnings. So earnings and employment are not a measure of teaching quality. Secondly, on retention, this is, and I think the government have a right to focus on not only encouraging more people from disadvantaged homes to go to university, but also to succeed once they're there and to support them once they're there. And retention is a measure of that. But I think it risks universities gaming in that if you want to get a good retention score under the TEF, then don't take students who are likely to fail or who need more support to succeed. And thirdly, the National Student Satisfaction Survey is a good measure of satisfaction. It's not necessarily a good measure of teaching quality. So I think that the government have got it wrong at their starting point. And if we're going to move towards measuring teaching quality, we ought to do it properly. So for example, the Higher Education Funding Council at the moment are doing some studies on learning gain, how much people move forward from the point at which they enter university to the point at which they graduate. And I think that could be a potentially interesting measure of teaching quality. But I think the government are rushing into this. The only thing that does provide me with some confidence is the fact that Chris, as your Vice-Chancellor, is chair of the TEF panel. And I'm not saying that because he's sitting there, but he's somebody with decent values who understands these issues, and I think will do the best to do well to make the best of a bad job.
Yeah, we need to move on. Natalie?
Well, coming back to the questions, grouping Luke and Mark's question, Natalie's question together, I suspect most people in this room know that the Green Party believes very passionately in zero university tuition fees for free education. And that's a position that comes not from politics, but from our values and principles. Because education is a public good. The whole of society is better off for every person who gets more and better education. So the cost of that should be met from general progressive taxation. Far more progressive taxation than it is now, but that's where the cost should be met from. And the reality is, I just don't think what has really been grasped is the impact that fees are having on people's lives. Students who are a few years older than you who are out there now in the world trying to get along. Because the reality is that any year you earn any sort of money at all, you're paying this money off towards that debt. Yet the last figures I saw, which were even before the recent changes that brought in fees for tuition fees and loans for master's degrees that took away the grant, 72% of students would never pay the loan off. So that means for 30 years of your life, for most people roughly from their mid-20s to their mid-50s, any year at all they earn any sort of money, they're going to be paying it towards